So it's good to see everybody. And as we're getting ready for snow here on this lovely February morning, and one more person is coming in. So there we go. So our portion today is Terumah. We're on page 485 in the Eitz Chaim, 485 in the Eitz Chaim, Terumah, or Exodus chapter 25, in whatever edition of the Chumash you have. Let me start with the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So our focus shifts again now here in the Torah. We had narrative from the beginning of Genesis through chapter 19 of Exodus. All of that was narrative, just telling the story of the creation of the world to the first family, to the first Jewish family and their descendants, slavery in Egypt, and the miraculous Exodus, getting to Mount Sinai. All of that, just telling a story. Chapter 20, with the 10 Commandments through last week's portion, is all about law and understanding our commitment to God through the covenant in the laws as defined so far, especially all the civil law. Now we shift again, and instead of story or instead of law, we're getting into focusing on worship. And you need a place to worship before you can before the Torah can describe to us how to worship. So the rest of the book of Exodus, with a tangent about the golden calf, so a chapter or two of that, aside from those couple of chapters, which is in the portion Kitisa 2 weeks from now, aside from that little part, everything else for now to the end of Exodus is about how the sanctuary, the portable sanctuary, the desert sanctuary, the tabernacle is to be built, and then how it was built. So it not only does the Torah describe everything that is supposed to be fashioned for the sanctuary and all the vestments, but it also describes how they were made. Which leads to lots of commentary about why all the focus on it. I mean, it's one thing to have this week's portion and next week's portion to describe the things that are needed. Why do you need two other portions to describe exactly to the down to the last detail how all the things were made? They could have just had a couple of sentences. Everything that was commanded to be made was made. So why all the attention? So let's look below the line on page 485 and see what the commentary has to say about all of this. The last third of the book of Exodus concerns itself entirely, except for the incident of the golden calf, with the construction of the tabernacle, a portable shrine to house the ark, and the tablets of the pact. So that's what the 10 Commandments are called, the tablets, Luchot HaBrit, the tablets of the covenant, or Luchot HaEdut, the tablets of the testimony or the pact. So after the life-altering experience of standing at Sinai, how does one keep the feeling of Sinai present? It can be maintained with sacred deeds, daily acts of justice and compassion, as outlined in the previous Parsha Mishpatim, right? So if we want to try to understand the context here, that perhaps the portion Mishpatim was presented last week as a way to keep the spirit and the awe of the moment of Sinai alive and keep it fresh every day. So if there are laws to follow, then following the law could be seen as a spiritual act. It could be understood as a way in which we can experience God's presence in our life. So, so when I maintain my speed when traveling on the ICC, I don't see that as a spiritual moment of connection with God, because the speed limit, as decided by the state of Maryland for the ICC, is not meant to be an opportunity for engaging with the spirituality of Maryland's Constitution and Maryland's code of law. Okay, now, there could be some lawyers who see the work they do as deeply personal, meaningful, and spiritual, but no lawyer could say that that it is religious. But when following Jewish law, and this gets to the conversation Jules and I were having before anybody came on today, following Jewish law, even to the nth degree, it can be argued, and it not only can it be argued, it definitely is part of the reason why there are all these laws. It's meant to elevate our life and every moment of life into a sacred moment. Okay, so it might be kind of weird to say this, but as you get ready to do your shopping for Passover and dread dealing with the crowds in the kosher markets and going through the list and paying all that money for all the kosher for Passover food, you could argue that you could try to make that into a spiritual moment. And in fact, it's supposed to be a spiritual moment, because buying that kosher for Passover food is fulfilling the commandment in the book of Exodus. It says you shall not have chametz in your home for the entirety of Passover. Okay, so following Jewish law is an opportunity to connect with God and elevate one's life. So the transition from Mount Sinai to the portion Mishpatim, the commentary is arguing so far. We're on page 485 for those who just came in. The argument is that how we act every single day is a way in which we can relive the Mount Sinai experience. And if we don't feel that way, then it's our obligation to try to feel that way, to take a moment to think about what we're doing before we do that routine act that we're going to do. So the commentary goes on. It can be accomplished by maintaining. So one way of maintaining the Mount Sinai experience is through daily sacred acts, or it could be accomplished by maintaining the observance of a sacred time on Shabbat and holy days. So you have sacred deeds, the commentary is suggesting. You have sacred time, Shabbat and holidays are sacred moments of, it's like Heschel says, Shabbat is a palace in time. We are creating a sacred moment, a sacred space so time becomes sacred. Or it could be maintained with sacred space. So this is from Ismar Schorsch, a former chancellor of the seminary, who suggests that we have sacred deeds, we have sacred time, and we have sacred space. fashioning a physical site to represent the presence of God in the midst of the community. Typically, the Torah and later Jewish usage will blend all three modes, deeds, space, and time, into an integrated way of life, right? So that if the best place to do Shabbat, well, let's say the best place to do any holiday or Shabbat would be the synagogue. So synagogue is sacred space in which we observe sacred time, which is Shabbat, with sacred deeds like praying the service or reading from the Torah or blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, things like that. So there are the sacred place provides the opportunity to bring also sacred deeds and sacred time together. Okay, so the ultimate goal is to break through the barriers and come into the presence of God. But that goal is not attained in an instant. There is a ladder of spiritual ascent alluded to in the prayer, which precedes the Shema in our morning service, where the text moves from the study of Torah to the performance of mitzvot to bonding with God, right? So there's this spiritual journey that we are on, and the deeds and the space and the time all work together in a sacred way to elevate our lives. So it's just, so when we think about the need for spending so much time on the construction, the design and construction of the Mishkan, you know, it's almost like you could still see this on my YouTube channel. I still have the videos from 9 years ago, 10 years ago, of the construction of Sharei Tefillah in Olney. You may remember that I took a video every week of the progress of construction. So the whole series of videos starts with sitting in the lawyer's office signing the mortgage, and then signing the agreement there with the construction company, the bank, and our representatives from Shul. We're sitting there around a conference table, signing the papers. So that's the first video of the series of videos, in which then I go to the empty lot, how the ground has been flattened, and then the rising of the girders and all that. And remember, there was one time right before the girders went up that thanks to the construction company themselves, they suggested, why not come to the site and write prayers on the girders in order to know that your own prayer went onto the frame itself, and that your prayers are really etched permanently in the structure of Sharei Tefillah. So you might remember that one Friday night in August that we gathered at the site. All these metal girders were on the ground, and Lisa Arbor was there with some suggestions if people didn't want to write, didn't want to trust their own spontaneity, some prayers to write with permanent marker on the girders. So that was a deeply spiritual moment in which the building, like the portion Terumah and Tetzaveh next week have for us, how the building of Sharei Tefillah congregation became that spiritual moment. And then, so we had Kabbalat Shabbat service right after we wrote onto the on the girders, and then we went to the Sandy Spring Bank building up George Avenue to have Shabbat dinner together. So it was a very, very moving moment in which sacred space became holy. Well, space became sacred for us, and that we not just watching the videos of how construction proceeded, but also being part of the process too, and writing the prayers onto the girders. So, um, so we're fortunate, all of us fortunate to have been, almost all of us on the screen here were part of that process. And if you weren't, you can look on my YouTube channel for those videos of the construction of the shul, and see how wonderful that was. So, but not everybody has the opportunity to have, some of us might remember the building. Well, I mean, Jules, I don't, not to pick on you, Jules. I know you keep saying you're 29 years old, but you are old enough to theoretically remember the first Sharei Tefillah, even though you weren't a member of the congregation yet at that point, 70 years ago. But we have Sylvia Potash and we have Manny Ginsberg who remember vividly. And Sylvia also has some movies of the Torah procession that was on Riggs Road, of bringing the Torahs into the first building on Riggs Road. I don't know if there was anything from the building in White Oak, but we have similar videos of bringing the Torahs into our building in Olney. So it's really a wonderful experience for a congregation to have that memory of actually building the synagogue and being part of it. So all of that just as part of this intro to what Terumah is all about and how we can make sense of it today. So why the focus on a tabernacle and what it does for us, so that it provides a place for sacred deeds and sacred time to come together. So the commentary below the line on 485 continues. Mount Sinai does not retain its holiness after the Israelites move on. It does not become a site of pilgrimage, which is true. There isn't an altar there. There isn't a place to go daven to for a spiritual center. Now, the spiritual center is based on wherever the Mishkan is, or later wherever the temple is, which is in Jerusalem. So the mountain, Mount Sinai, is not holy. God is holy, and God's presence is what makes a place holy, or which is important, okay? Any place can become a holy place if God is present in that place, okay? So, in other words, you don't need necessarily a building. Well, even when you have a building set aside to be a synagogue, it becomes holy because the Torahs are there, because the community has said that this is the place where we're going to be davening. And during COVID now, we've been challenged in making our Zoom screen that we see in front of us that holy place. And that it begs the question of really what is sacred space? And how do you define sacred space today? Is space really the physical space that our body takes up? Or is it the digital space that our image takes up? Right? So in other words, my laptop right now that I'm looking at with 17 Zoom screens on it, so all of you on it, I'm sitting in a chair in a bedroom upstairs in my house with a virtual background behind me, giving an impression of a certain kind of space, but I'm misleading you because really there's just a green screen behind me in this extra bedroom in my house. Okay, so I'm misleading everyone about the space that I'm in. And then there's the digital space that I'm in. I got the AirPods in my ear, which connect me to the screen that is just 2 feet in front of me, with a webcam that connects to all of you. So is that enough to make it digitally, to make this sacred space? So it's fascinating discussion, and I don't know enough about the physics behind it and the science behind it to say what is this so-called digital space that we've created. And I've said that it's enough for us to make this a minyan, and that we could theoretically say Kaddish and have a service with the 17 screens that we have in front of us here. There are those who argue that no, this isn't enough to define space, and that space needs to be defined physically, not digitally. So it's a real discussion that is happening within the conservative movement as to how we define space now, especially on Zoom. So it's an interesting concept of what we do to make our space holy, and that pre-COVID, we wouldn't have imagined that digital space would be a factor in the conversation, but now it will forever be part of the conversation. Okay, so when God's presence is what makes a place holy. When the people leave Sinai, the commentary continues, they do not leave God. God accompanies them on their journey, and the tabernacle is to be a symbol of that, right? So not only is there a God moving in front of the people as a pillar of fire by day, a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night, but also once the tabernacle is complete at the end of the book of Exodus, there is a description of God's presence lowering itself as a cloud onto the tabernacle, so that that cloud enters into the tabernacle and accompanies and the tabernacle is always in the middle of the people. The book of Numbers describes how the people are camped around the tabernacle. The tabernacle is the heart of the community, and you have the 12 tribes. You have the 4 Levitical families first around the tabernacle, and then the 12 tribes around them. So in these concentric squares around the tabernacle, with the Holy of Holies in the center of the tabernacle itself. So when the people leave Sinai, they do not leave God. God accompanies them on their journey, and the tabernacle is to be a symbol of that. The later temple, the later temples built in Jerusalem by Solomon and by the Jews returning from Babylonia did not follow the plan given here. Different generations build their houses of worship in ways appropriate to their own times and needs. Right. So that is correct. And there are different models of synagogue sanctuaries, as we know, based on Ashkenazi versus Sephardi, based on where the center of the service is going to be, on the bima, in the middle of the congregation, that kind of thing. So, you go from synagogue to, you go from a B'nai Israel with the cantor standing in the middle of the sanctuary on a on a raised platform, to our synagogue, if you remember, with a podium on the floor and another table on the bima, to the old-fashioned synagogue where everything was front and center, faced on the bima, which was raised up and not handicapped accessible. So it all synagogue architecture is constantly changing and evolving. Bravanel, let's see, Arnie has a question here in the chat. If leaving Mount Sinai made it no longer holy, how would just a remnant of once active temple remain holy when it's no longer functioning? You're absolutely right, Arnie, and I can't explain how the Kotel becomes considered such a holy place. And it is, I think it's more because of the politics around it. It's not just about the Kotel, it's about tombs of patriarchs that are found in Hebron, the tomb of Joseph found in Shechem or Nablus, depending on your politics and how you refer to that town. Other so-called holy sites are deemed that way, Arnie, I think more for politics than for really religion. And I think that, you know, that iconic image of the soldiers at the Kotel in 1967, you know, you don't have to be religious to have that whenever you know, so let me say it this way. Just because I'm a rabbi, I don't get chills down my spine every time I see that picture, okay? Or when I hear the opening guitar strumming of Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, when Shuli Natan in 1967, she was the one who sang that Naomi Shemer song. Just it has a guitar intro. Even talking about it now brings tears to my eyes, because because I was raised in a strongly Zionist home, a home which attempted Aliyah twice, and I've been to Israel countless times, thank God. So Israel is central to my Jewish life. So because it is, I still remember the first time I saw the Kotel, and I was 6 years old. So that was 53 years ago. So I still remember that moment. And for those of us who have been to Israel, and going to Israel becomes a spiritual journey, seeing the Kotel becomes a spiritual moment. So it's not just another stop on the tour. You know, it's not just something in the tour book, like I'm following this walk today, and stop number 9 is the Kotel. Let's go on to stop number 10, which is a lunch break. Okay, so it's not like that. For some people, it is like that, but for Jews, it's not. So I would argue with you, Arnie, that that the Kotel is in and of itself is not holy, because, well, first of all, it's just a retaining wall. Okay, there never was anything holy about that Kotel. But what makes that wall spiritual for me is, and I would say it differently than calling it holy. It's spiritual because I know that Kotel is 2,000 years old. So for me, that's saying something, that Kotel has survived for 2,000 years. And what's even more spiritual is the southern end of that Kotel, which is where the egalitarian prayer plaza is, where you actually see the boulders that were pushed off by the Romans, still there 2,000 years later. You still see the remnants of the market stalls still there at the foot of the Kotel, and you have Hebrew words on some of the stones that say Lebeit HaTekiot, for example. This is the way to go where the shofar blowing happens. So that makes it a spiritual place for me, and makes, if I'm ever there to daven, then that I feel connected right there. Okay.
I was actually arguing that the Mount Sinai, if we knew where it was, seems to me is also holy.
You would think that it would be. And so I keep telling this story that when I was at Hebrew University for my junior year, before the first semester started, like after Sukkot, before the semester started, there was a trip that was offered to go to the Sinai, which had just been handed over to Egypt. So it was a fun trip. There were like 30 of us on the trip, and part of the trip was to camp in a Bedouin camp, and then wake up before dawn and hike at dawn up Mount Sinai. And when we get up Mount Sinai, and you think it's Mount Sinai because there's a monastery at the foot of it, Santa Caterina. So it's associated with Mount Sinai. They think that it's called Jebel Musa, which is Moses Mountain. That's what the Bedouins call it. So you think so the tour guide, when we get up to the top of Mount Sinai, well, we're not sure. So after all that, but so you don't know, but yeah, so if it is, it's pretty cool that you're up there. And in that Santa Catarina, they have what they think is the remnant of the burning bush still there, this caper bush. So yeah, it is what we make it into. Okay, but you don't have the Haredim flocking to Mount Sinai and setting up a shul there. There's no synagogue at Mount Sinai, which is fascinating, where there are tons of little shuls in the tunnel leading out next to the kotel, right? You go into the tunnels there, so many different davening spaces there. So, so Jan she wrote a private message, but it relates, is the remains of the temple, the kotel, so important, as at that time that the temple was not just a synagogue, but the center of Jewish life and civilization. Yes, there's that to why the kotel is so important too. And that, being up on the Temple Mount, which I've been on a couple of times, is really cool as well. So seeing all these ancient artifacts brings raises my spirituality, but to the point of so let's say I lived in Jerusalem, I would not walk to the kotel every day to say that this is where I need to daven every day. Whatever neighborhood I'm living in, I'd go to whatever shul is there, preferably a Masorti conservative shul. That's where I would go, and that's where I'd feel spiritual. I don't really feel spiritual when I go to the kotel because I'm egalitarian, and going to the kotel, you're forced to be Orthodox to daven in that way. If I could go to the egalitarian plaza, which I would go there, but I wouldn't go there every day. Which gets to this point from this commentary that sacred space is where we make it. Okay, so if 10 Jews are together in the middle of a desert, and they decide it's time to daven mincha, then that becomes sacred space, where the moment before it was just a stop in their walk, right? So something like that. If you're on a hike somewhere and you just decide in that moment to pray, that space becomes a spiritual space, and that's the beauty of understanding this idea of space. So the temple in Jerusalem. So let me say it this way: before the rabbis came along, there was only one sacred space, and that's wherever the tabernacle was, or later where the temple was in Jerusalem. So before the rabbis, there's only one sacred space, and that no matter where you are, you can't bring a sacrifice wherever you are. You have to bring it in that one and only sacred space. The rabbis radicalized this idea and created this notion that there is no longer one sacred space. There are now an infinite number of possible sacred spaces around the world or in the universe. Wherever Jews travel, there can be a sacred space. We look forward to the day when the temple will be rebuilt and will serve as a unifying force in Judaism. But until that day comes, we will continue to have our multiple, nearly infinite amount of sacred spaces. So some spaces in and of itself are inherently spiritual, like the kotel, or I don't know. I think that I've never been to Prague, and I think someday I'd like to go to Prague and go to the Altneu Shul. I think if I went to the Altnoy Shul, that would be a sacred space for me. And I would think that that would be almost as sacred as going to the Kotel itself, because how old the Altnoy Shul is. I haven't visited a concentration camp. I would think that that would be a sacred space too. So just these places that have history associated with it, good or bad, tragic or celebratory, makes it perpetually a sacred space. Yes, Elizabeth.
I was just saying how, it's interesting to try to understand how do we perceive it as a sacred space? Is it passed down through generations? Is it something inherent that you sense? Because I shared with you about the first time as a kid looking at a picture of the hotel, it took my breath away. And I felt like being happy and crying at the same time when I saw it for the first time. Didn't even know what it was. I had to ask, what is that?
Right.
And then when I was told, I said, oh, well, that makes sense. It made sense to my child brain for some reason. So it's interesting to, how is this transmitted from generation to generation?
Right. No, it is. It's right. So it's, Elizabeth, you raise an important point. And, certainly through education, through prayer, those experiences, it's just inherent in what we learn and what we pray that Jerusalem is a central place, and the Temple Mount is a holy place. But what about those who haven't necessarily had those real life experiences yet? How do they still have some kind of mystical, subconscious sense that a place that they're in is holy? I have no idea how that works, but I know that it does work, and people have those experiences. So that raises, it's like, so Jacob says this when he has the dream of the angels going up and down on the ladder. And he says at the end, I'm in a holy place. How did I know that this was not a holy place? So he didn't know it was a holy place. He just stopped there. So did he stop there because there was some aura, some sense in the ground itself? I've been to Sedona, Arizona, and they say that they have these mystical kind of spiritual, I don't even know the name of the term, the Native American term for these, you feel something in the ground, in the soil, has like this sense of mysticism about it. And I forget, it's escaping me what it is, but there are several of these sites around Sedona, Arizona, where you can go, and there's these mystical sacred spaces. Anyway, so is it something about the ground that drew Jacob to that spot? Or because Jacob stopped there, God entered his mind, had him have this dream, and then had Jacob realize, now that I had this dream of my encounter with God, then this space became a sacred space. So is a space inherently sacred, independent of people, or do people make a place sacred? And I don't have an answer to that question. I think it's yes, both are true. And so how this gets passed on, so it's different people have different reactions to these places. I'll tell you, for example, going into, so I watched the new, I try to watch the ABC News at 9:30 on Channel 8. And so David Muir, it was 2 years, I think yesterday was 2 years when Notre Dame Cathedral burned. So 2 years later, what the work involved there. So, for me, Notre Dame, it's impressive, but I don't feel spiritual in it. I'll tell you what cathedral I did feel spiritual in. It was the Gaudi Cathedral in Barcelona. That cathedral, I'll tell you, it's the inside space. There's nothing Catholic about the inside space. It's totally universal. It's supposed to be nature, and that, because I knew, and from the tour, that it was presented that way, that there's nothing Catholic, nothing Christian about the inside of that cathedral in Barcelona. That became a spiritual space for me. That was awesome to be in there. I highly recommend it. When it's safe to travel again, go to Barcelona, go to that cathedral. It's truly remarkable. There's certainly Christian imagery on the outside of the cathedral, but once you're inside, no matter who you are, what religion you are, inside, you can't help but be moved spiritually. Vortex, that's the term. Yes. Thank you, Arnie. Was that the vortexes? Yes. So, right. I had no sense even being at a vortex, and the sign says you are now standing in a vortex. Nothing about me felt any different, but some people could claim that they feel different when they're standing in that vortex in Sedona. So anyway, so Notre Dame does not, in fact, what Notre Dame does make me feel is hatred towards the Catholic Church because of the statues that are outside before you walk in. So some of the statues are anti-Semitic on purpose. So clearly I, as a Jew, am not welcome inside Notre Dame. And because I know what those statues stand for, I went in anyway because it's a historical landmark and the architecture is impressive and the gargoyles are pretty cool, but there's nothing spiritual about that for me at all. And in fact, it just promotes further hatred. Okay, so what sacred space does and the power of sacred space and how we continue to redefine space, especially in this Zoom age. So I just want to finish this commentary here in the time that we have left. Bravanel suggests that one purpose of the tabernacle was to combat the idea that God had forsaken the earth, choosing to reside exclusively in heaven, remote from humanity. So that's an interesting idea too, that with the development of religion, that God is out there and we are here, that it's helpful for us, for any religion which tries to bridge the gap between God and humanity, that you need sacred space to help do that and to help concretize the abstract ideas of theology. The sages calculated that the command to build a tabernacle was given on Yom Kippur, the 10th of Tishrei. So that's the midrash that was found. The tabernacle would be a tent of witness to the fact that God was still in Israel's midst, even when they fall short of what they had promised to be. So if the tabernacle was commanded to be built on Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur is a day of atonement, when we feel guilty for where we've gone wrong, then the tabernacle is a reminder of where we can go right and how we can make amends. There's also a tradition that the instructions to fashion a tabernacle actually were given after the events recounted in Exodus 32, when the Israelites made the golden calf. And parenthetically here, the Torah does not always present events in strict chronological order. So there is a rabbinic idea, ein mukdam u'me'uchar b'Torah. There's no early or late in the Torah. In other words, the Torah is not written as a history book, not meant to be understood as being presented in chronological order. And so therefore, Terumah and Tetzaveh are suggested, and the first part of Kitisa, which finishes the description of things to be fashioned for the altar, for the Mishkan, all of that was given after the events of the golden calf. So that we have all of this then suggested by the rabbis as atonement for the golden calf itself. The tabernacle would then serve as a tent of witness to the reality of penitence and forgiveness. The incident of the golden calf becomes less of a threat to sever the relationship between God and Israel when we know beforehand that reconciliation will follow, right? So had it been presented in chronological order, then more of a sense then that the building of the tabernacle could also be understood as penitence for that great sin of the golden calf. And then this last paragraph, following the latter tradition stated above, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev suggests, he's a Hasidic rabbi, like I think a son-in-law of the Baal Shem Tov, that God has to command Moses to speak to the Israelites because Moses is so angry at them after the incident of the golden calf, right? The very first verse is, Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, Daber el Bnei Yisrael. Second verse. God speaks to Moses saying, speak to the people of Israel and tell them to do the following. So suggests that God has to command Moses to speak to the Israelites because Moses is so angry at them after the incident of the golden calf. God has to remind him that a leader should never give up on his people, no matter how much they may disappoint him. So all these interesting ideas that we can understand from the Mishkan. Certainly, we all look forward to the day when we can go back into our synagogue building. But in the meantime, as we have seen, we have been able to make spaces that we have been in sacred nonetheless. So any other questions or comments about the portion today? So we'll stop here for today because it doesn't make sense to go into anything else. We won't have enough time to get to anything else. But that's the great thing about this commentary that I read this yesterday or the day before. I didn't even think about the videos that I had made of the synagogue at that time, and so it just came to me today when I wasn't thinking of it before, and all the other things that we came up today. So anyway, have a good rest of the day. Stay safe with the snow tomorrow. Good luck. Jules is supposed to get his vaccine tomorrow, but it may not happen tomorrow. But good luck with all of that and with all of you getting your shots, and have a good rest of the day.
Take care, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Stay
Bye-bye.
safe.
Yep.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.